For centuries, people have searched for a city of gold, and no one has ever found it. Not once. Not even close. And that's where this stops making sense. Because this wasn't a vague rumor whispered across time, it was a story detailed enough to drive real people to risk everything in pursuit of it. Expeditions crossed entire continents, navigated unfamiliar rivers, pushed through dense jungles, and vanished into landscapes they didn't understand, all chasing something they believed was real. And these weren't random wanderers. They were organized, funded, and driven by a level of certainty that usually comes from something observed, something witnessed, something that felt close enough to reach. And yet, after all of it, nothing. No city. No ruins. No trace that matches the scale of what they were searching for. And that absence creates a problem that doesn't resolve easily. Because when something is described with that much consistency and conviction, it usually comes from somewhere. Stories don't sustain themselves for centuries without some form of origin. And if there was an origin, if something real was seen, reported, and then pursued, then what exactly were they chasing? Was it something that existed and was lost? Or something that changed as it moved from one person to another, growing larger each time it was told? Because the longer the search continued without success, the more the story transformed from a destination into something else entirely, a question that no one could fully answer, but no one could fully dismiss either. To understand why El Dorado mattered, you have to strip away the idea of a city of gold and go back to the earliest accounts that gave the story its shape. Those accounts didn't describe a place built from gold, but a ritual tied to leadership and belief, something specific enough to be seen, but not necessarily understood by those observing it. A leader, covered in gold dust, standing at the edge of a sacred body of water, making offerings that sank beneath the surface. That image is important, because it shifts the entire narrative from something impossible to something plausible. It becomes a moment, not a myth. And those moments are often tied to real places, real people, and real practices. In regions of what is now Colombia, gold held meaning beyond wealth. It was symbolic, tied to identity, belief, and connection to something greater than ownership. And when those practices were observed by outsiders, they weren't interpreted within their original context. They were translated, expanded, transformed. Because what one culture sees as ritual, another may see as evidence of abundance. And that's where the shift begins. A ritual becomes a place. A place becomes a city. And a city becomes something limitless. And once that transformation takes hold, it becomes difficult to reverse. Because the story no longer belongs to its origin, it belongs to those who are chasing it. And that's what made El Dorado powerful. Not just the idea of gold, but the belief that somewhere, something extraordinary existed, waiting to be found. And the people searching for it weren't just chasing wealth, they were chasing certainty. The idea that the world still held something undiscovered, and that they could be the ones to uncover it. And this is where everything begins to fall apart. Because the deeper those expeditions went, the less the story aligned with reality. Instead of finding something more defined, they found less. Terrain became more difficult to navigate, not less. Information became inconsistent, not clearer. Descriptions began to conflict with each other, each new account shifting the location, the scale, or the nature of what was being described. Rivers that were expected to lead somewhere ended in nothing. Regions that were believed to contain answers produced only fragments, evidence of life, but not of anything that matched the legend. And this is where it stops making sense, because if something that significant existed, it shouldn't become harder to find over time. It should become easier. More defined. More traceable. But the opposite was happening. The more people searched, the more the story expanded, and the less it pointed to anything specific. And that creates a different kind of tension. Not that the city is hidden, but that the idea of the city may have moved beyond what originally existed. Because once a story grows large enough, it stops pointing to a single place. It begins to stretch across multiple regions, multiple interpretations, and multiple expectations. And at that point, the search itself becomes unstable. Not because the place is difficult to reach, but because the target itself is no longer clearly defined. And when that happens, the search doesn't fail because of distance. It fails because of direction. Over time, multiple locations have been proposed as the possible site of El Dorado, each one supported by fragments of evidence, and each one ultimately falling short of confirmation. Deep within the Amazon basin, where dense forest conceals anything that isn't directly exposed. High in the Andes, where altitude and terrain limit access and visibility. Remote regions where the environment itself becomes a barrier to understanding what lies beneath it. And in each case, the same pattern emerges. Something is found, but it doesn't resolve the mystery. Remains of settlements, traces of human presence, signs that people lived, moved, and built within these regions, but nothing that matches the legend in full. No city of gold. No concentrated evidence that explains the scale of the story. And what makes this more complex is that each discovery adds credibility to the idea that something existed, while simultaneously proving that it was not what people expected it to be. And every new finding creates a contradiction. Because now the question is no longer whether people were there, but whether what they were looking for was ever there in the form they imagined. And with each failed attempt, the possibility shifts. Not toward confirmation, but toward uncertainty. Because if El Dorado is not where it was expected to be, then the problem may not be the location. It may be the assumption of what it actually was. And once that assumption is questioned, the entire structure of the search begins to change. So why hasn't anyone found El Dorado? One explanation is that it never existed as a single place, that it was a story built from real observations, expanded over time until it no longer pointed to a specific reality. That what began as something grounded became something abstract, shaped by interpretation rather than fact. But that explanation doesn't fully remove the tension. Because the consistency of the early accounts suggests that something was seen, something specific enough to be repeated, remembered, and pursued. And that leaves a second possibility. That something did exist, but not in the way people were searching for it. Not a city. Not a structure. But something smaller, more precise, and more easily lost to time. And if that's true, then the mystery isn't that El Dorado is missing, it's that people have been searching for the wrong thing from the very beginning. And that possibility is difficult to ignore. Because it suggests that the failure to find El Dorado is not a failure of effort, but a failure of understanding. That the answer may have been present all along, hidden not by distance or difficulty, but by expectation. And that is what keeps the story alive. Not proof. Not discovery. But the gap between what was described and what has been found. Because as long as that gap exists, the question remains. Not where is El Dorado? But what was it really? Some places aren't lost. They were never what we thought they were. If this made you question what history really tells us, you're not the only one thinking it. And you're in the right place. Join us next time. Tilt and chill. Stay curious.